Integration runtime is the compute infrastructure used by Data Factory. There are three types of integration runtimes: Azure Integration Runtime, Self-Hosted Integration Runtime, and Azure SSIS Integration Runtime. First, let's talk about Azure and the Self-Hosted Integration Runtime. Azure Integration Runtime can copy data between cloud data stores, and it can dispatch the activity to a variety of compute services such as Azure HT Insights or SQL Server, where the transformation takes place. The self-hosted integration runtime is a software with essentially the same code as the Azure IR, but you install it on an on-premise machine or a virtual machine in a virtual network. A self-hosted IR can run copy activities between a public cloud data store and a data store in a private network, and it can also dispatch transformation activities against compute resources in a private network. But you might ask, why self-hosted IR? Why can't I run all my activities on the Azure IR itself? The most popular answer is that Data Factory will not be able to directly access on-prem data sources as they sit behind a firewall. It is sometimes possible to establish a direct connection between Azure and an on-prem data sources by configuring your firewall in a specific way, and if you do that, you don't need to use the self-hosted IR, but this is something that admins aren't always happy to do. Let's take a scenario to understand how integration runtime works with Data Factory to orchestrate data movement. So I have a Data Factory pipeline with two activities. The first is a copy activity to move the data from SQL Server to Azure Data Lake Store, and the second activity processes the data with Data Lake Analytics and stores it in the Data Lake Store. So you have the on-prem environment with SQL Server sitting behind a firewall and the Data Lake Store within the Azure cloud. When the first activity begins, the Data Factory directs the self-hosted IR to copy the data from SQL Server to Data Lake Store. If you're wondering where the self-hosted IR is defined, it is defined in the link services that connects to the SQL Server. So in this case, the self-hosted integration runtime performs the copy activity. Once the data is copied, the second activity begins and Data Factory sends a command to the Azure Integration Runtime this time, which then dispatches the activity to Data Lake Analytics to transform the data and store it in Data Lake Store. Note that your Data Factory instance and the Azure Integration Runtime can be in different regions. The integration runtime is usually closer to the data source. With Azure SSIS Integration Runtime, you can natively execute SSIS packages in a managed environment. So when we lift and shift the SSIS packages to Data Factory, we use Azure SSIS Integration Runtime. So first you create Azure SSIS Integration Runtime, which creates Integration Services Catalog in Azure SQL Database for your SSIS packages to live. When the pipeline activity begins, Data Factory sends a command to the Azure SSIS IR, which then executes the SSIS packages.